Hello, AP World History students. Welcome back to our final module, Module 4. So first off, I just want to start off for congratulating those of you guys who did the AP exam last week. I didn't hear any complaints or any horror stories, so I'm assuming everything worked out just fine. And like I said, I'm very proud of you guys this year and proud to have been your teacher. All right, so we're finishing up this unit for the year, I guess, in this case, talking about decolonization and globalization. So decolonization deals with all those former European colonies that became independent after World War II. Because really what happened, I guess a broad story is, Europeans tried to control these colonies in Africa and in Asia in particular. However, after World War II, Europeans were pretty much decimated and could no longer control them anymore. So we're looking at some of those countries and basically some of the ramifications of those new independent countries. And then we'll end by talking about globalization leading up into modern day. All right, so for independent states, there's really two main areas we're talking about. One is Israel, India, and then I guess really, really big, where Africa's not a country, but really, really big, what happened to Africa, considering most of Africa was colonized in the 1800s, early 1900s. And the first one we're talking about is Israel. So after World War I, the area that's now Israel is called Palestine, and it actually used to be part of the Ottoman Empire. But the Ottoman Empire dies in World War I, so then it actually becomes a British mandate, which basically temporary ownership to overlook them while they're learning how to be more civilized. Until the end of World War II. And then after World War II, with the new United Nations and England together, decided that they should give a place for the Jews to live, back their homeland. And that would be Israel. And one of the conflicts that's still going on today with this is, I know Europeans, they love making plans about looking at a map and saying this should go here, this should go there. However, one thing they didn't really think about too much was the Palestinians, the local Arabs that were already there, and how would they feel about the fact that their territory that they live in is now Israel, which identifies itself as a purely Jewish state, and Israel really does not want any Palestinians at all in as their citizens. So that conflict still goes on today. If you look on the map, you can see the Gaza Strip on the left side of Israel, and then of course the West Bank is that big tan area right by Jerusalem. Those areas were reserved, or I guess kind of still reserved, for Palestinians. However, if you look at our next slide, you can see how Palestinian control has slowly dwindled throughout the years. So you see on the left-hand side, this is immediately after World War II, where most land was Palestinian land. But then you can see the second one, that's the UN partition. And then eventually you can see the third slide. It's essentially what Israel kind of looks like today. However, I would say that third slide is outdated in that even though technically the West Bank is completely owned by Palestinians, at least when you look at that picture, in actuality, if you look on the far right-hand side, that's how much land Palestinians actually own in the West Bank. A large portion of the West Bank is actually controlled by Jewish citizens. This is something called a settler movement that happened, which essentially just means a lot of Jewish people claim that Palestine belongs to them completely, and they don't really want West Bank to exist at all. So a lot of Jewish people have just simply moved into the West Bank and settled communities in there. And I'll put a video on, actually I think the YouTube video is on your web quest, so you can see us talking more about this conflict. But when you talk about trying to make peace in Palestine between Palestinians and Israel, it's really a lot more complicated than you would think, because most people think, well, you should just give a separate country to Palestine and a separate country for Israel. But just looking at this map right here, you can see where would you get Palestine their separate country. A lot of Palestinians are dispersed all over the place now, with a lot of Jewish citizens in between them. All right, next up, we're going to talk about India. Let me get all the slides up there for you. So India, if you recall, was a British territory. It originally was controlled by the East India Company, but then after the Sepoy Rebellion in 1857, the British government took control. So after World War II is when India becomes independent. And if you look at, this is a modern day map of what India is like, but originally Bangladesh and Pakistan were part of India. And it was only after India became independent that Bangladesh and Pakistan became also independent countries. And the main conflict there is something you might be familiar with, is where India has a minority Muslim population but a majority Hindu. So what happens is going to be a lot of violence in India when they become independent. and it's going to be between Muslims and Hindus. And India is going to be officially going to become a Hindu state, essentially. Well, that's really, especially if you pay attention to the news today. If you're a Muslim citizen in India, you're probably not treated very good. And whereas Bangladesh and Pakistan are Muslim countries, and I think if I remember correctly, Pakistan is named Islamabad as their capital. So I mean, Islam is in the name of their capital. And what happens if you're like maybe a Hindu but was living in what's now Pakistan, or what happens if you're Muslim and you're living in what was India during that time period? And the answer is you're pretty much forced to move or face violence and possible death as well. So it was a large mass migration that really started from here. And one of the criticisms, again, that you can give with Europeans on here, a British person is the one that actually drew the line between India and Pakistan. And once again, you have an outsider trying to draw lines for a local area. And sometimes the lines he drew did not quite make sense. So a lot of people had to move just to try to fit into what the new lines were. All right, one of the big guys I want you guys to know for India is, of course, Gandhi. And Gandhi was one of the leading figures to call for independence from Britain. And he was doing a lot of passive resistance, nonviolent resistance. And essentially his motto was quit India. There are so many Indians in India that British people can't possibly govern without Indian help. So quite frankly, he just said, let's just quit helping them, and eventually they'll be forced to let us be independent. And they were on the verge of getting independence actually right before World War II started. But once World War II started, he actually decides to hold back on declaring independence because he wanted to support England when they were fighting Germany. But once Germany's over, that's when they do declare independence. And sadly, if you want to know about Gandhi and how he died, he actually ended up dying because a religious extremist ended up shooting him. He advocated for peace between Hindus and Muslims, and let's just say it did not work out well for him. He tried, but even Gandhi ends with assassination. Very similar to our nonviolent leader here in the United States, Martin Luther King Jr. All right, next up, very briefly, let's talk about Africa. And this is just giving you a map of different of Africa in general and the phases of them getting independence. So you can see independence started in the 1940s, shortly after World War II, accelerated in the 50s and 60s until pretty much, I think, every African nation is pretty much free at this point. I think maybe Western Sahara by Morocco is a disputed territory, but for the most part, they're now all independent countries. And sometimes these independent countries came from a peaceful transition, like mostly in Western Africa. You can see it was mostly a negotiated peace type thing where there was no violence necessary. However, if you look at like Kenya and Algeria, there were some serious violent wars going on there where hundreds of thousands of Africans ended up dying fighting for their independence before they got free. And I'll tell you this, I know Algeria, one of the reasons why France fought so fiercely to try to keep it was because Algeria has an important resource: oil. All right, so we're going to move on to talking about South Africa now, in more particular, because this is the one that a lot of people point out a lot. So South Africa is mostly known as the country that had apartheid, which was the separation between whites and blacks. So even though the whites were the minority in Africa, because they were the colonizers, they're the ones that pretty much ran society even after they were independent. And it really wasn't until the 1990s that black Africans, started to get equal say in the government. And they eventually elected Nelson Mandela in the 1994, and he became president. And if you're looking for a good movie to watch that kind of talks about this, is Invictus. And I normally do show Invictus at the end of the year. Obviously, we just can't do it this year. But if you want to, go on the internet or whatever and try to find Invictus and watch it about Nelson Mandela. He actually was a civil rights activist in the early, I think, 70s, maybe 60s. And he eventually gets arrested for his civil activism. He gets freed, I think, in 1990 and then gets elected in 1994. So imagine spending decades of your life in prison, get released from prison, and then you become president of your country. So it was a pretty big deal in South Africa. Other big problems in Africa that's more modern day stuff that hopefully a lot of you guys are aware of is in Sudan and Rwanda. So Rwanda in the 1994, there was a genocide there between Hutus and Tutsis. And if I remember correctly, the Tutsis were more light-skinned than the Hutus. So under colonial times, the Tutsis were giving more favor by the government, whereas the Hutus were treated as more second-class citizens. So once that I guess the colonialism government went away, that resentment still remained, and it was really horrible. Lots of Hutus killing Tutsis. And if you're looking for a movie that kind of illustrates this, I believe it's Hotel Rwanda. I think Mr. Miner shows it a lot in Human Geography. Warning for that one, it is about a genocide, so it is pretty graphic. The other area in Africa I just want to briefly touch on is in Sudan, Darfur, South Sudan. And like I said, I like this part right here. They actually debate, is this a genocide or not? United States, I think we say yes. UN says no. And one of the main reasons why you say no is really just has to do with politics. If you declare something as a genocide, that kind of gives you a moral obligation to actually do something about it. Whereas if you don't declare it a genocide, then you can try to basically ignore it. I will say today, this slide's a bit outdated now, in that South Sudan now is an independent country now, in the bottom part right there. However, it is one of the more impoverished countries in the world and still having a lot of problems. All right, now jumping ahead to globalization, because we're just moving super fast through everything. We're just talking about the modern day economy and basically talking about how society has started to move really, really fast, especially compared to what has happened in the past. Technology causes great advancements in society, and especially between like when I was a kid to where you guys are now, it's changed dramatically. When I was growing up, believe it or not, I didn't get internet until I think I was about 8 years old, and it was one of those landline computers. And I didn't get a smartphone, like my iPhone, until I was in grad school. So even from me to you guys, which is not that far, there's been a huge dramatic change due to technology. All right, so some of the technologies that they point out, and this dates back to 1900 to present, and I just kind of picked out some of the big ones. Antibiotics, being able to treat diseases. Penicillin was probably the most important antibiotic created in world history, and it helps treat a lot of diseases that would otherwise end up killing people. And they said a lot of times it was like, if you got a disease, you're pretty much going to die. But penicillin helps treat those infections. Vaccines, of course, you hear in the news right now, we're trying to treat COVID-19 and trying to find a vaccine for it. Probably the biggest historical vaccine that we get mentioned a lot is polio. But of course, as you guys know, to even go to school, you have to get a bunch of vaccines to stay safe. Pre-vaccine times, we had a lot higher child mortality. And of course, if there's like a big disease wiping through like there is right now, what do you do if there's no vaccine? And the best way to do it is socially distance and keep away from society. So I think you say, historically speaking, we've actually been pretty spoiled for having vaccines for so long. And I think our current situation, if anything, is a reminder of the importance of science and vaccines. Birth control is something I think you'll end up talking more about in United States history. But birth control, it's the pill women take to prevent getting pregnant. So before that time, you're more likely to have a baby if you ever had sex. But now with birth control, women start having more liberation, more freedom, and do social choices as they choose. I already briefly talked about internet and how internet's rapidly changing things at a huge pace. And I bet if you're just paying attention between last year and this year, looking at the internet, it's going to be, just think about it. We might end up doing a lot more stuff on the internet. I mean, right now you're listening to me over the internet. Pop culture is just really popular culture. The idea that, it's basically think about Hollywood spreading American movies across the globe, not just in the United States, but across the globe. And of course, I think there's Bollywood and Hollywood. And Bollywood in India and whatnot. So talking about cultures from like one area of the world can rapidly spread all to other parts of the world. And the last one we'll talk about very, very briefly, which is something I think Human Geography people has talked about, was the Green Revolution, which there used to be concern that we're going to run out of food in the world, and eventually there's not going to be enough food to do the growing population. But step in that time period, scientists started doing crossbreeding of plants. If you look in the background of the slide, that's the dwarf wheat, which was a wheat that was a lot more rugged. It could be in much more different environments and stand up to drier climates, and it produced more calories. So through technology and production of higher yielding foods, we were able to keep up with the population growth rate. And these are just some diseases that we fought throughout. Again, this is about 1900 to present. So malaria, tuberculosis, cholera, HIV/AIDS, Ebola. I put COVID-19. It's not in your curriculum, but obviously I think that's going to be in the curriculum in the future. heart disease, Alzheimer's. These are diseases that are still affecting the world today. Obviously, some of these are not necessarily affecting us in the United States, but in more impoverished countries in the world, like in Africa and whatnot, these diseases are still rampant and something that we need, is still a problem that we need to help start fixing. There has been a lot of, like, Doctors Without Borders is an organization that tries to help cure these diseases and try to eliminate these diseases, but there's stuff that we're still fighting. And the heart disease and Alzheimer's, this is talking about more third world country problems. So maybe we can, the United States and some Western European countries don't have to worry about some of these diseases because we have antibiotics and vaccines. But however, we are still affected by heart disease and basically disease you can get when you get older. All right, kind of looking at present and even starting to look ahead, what are some potential challenges that we as a society face today that could end up affecting something future, even future wars? And I think one of the number one things that could potentially happen is resource inequalities. And we think about fossil fuels, and fossil fuels certainly is one of them that could cause problems, and even the climate change caused by fossil fuels. There's a lot of studies that show that a lot of times climate change is not going to necessarily affect the first world countries as much as it's going to affect the third world countries actually the most. So even though maybe like some small countries that don't really contribute to climate change as much, they're the ones that'll probably get most adversely affected by the climate change. And that is an ongoing thing that, especially in the United Nations, that gets talked about a lot, where they're trying to convince countries to go off fossil fuels. But of course, the United States or UN can't force countries to do it. And in fact, United States, we are not the number one fossil fuel producer, but we're definitely pretty high on the list. The other, I think the biggest thing that a lot of people aren't thinking of, unless maybe if you took human geography last year, is you think about water. And this map right on the top right there, those orange lines, I believe, are dams. So water resource scarcity is a huge problem. And a lot of historians or social scientists think our next war is not going to be over oil, which is, I guess, like maybe the number one guess, but over water. Because when you dam off a river, what you do is you're cutting off water from going downstream. And if you're looking at this map right here, you can see like the Euphrates River is dammed off in Turkey, then it's dammed off again in Syria, and then you can see even in Iraq it's dammed off in the top part, where you see the bottom part of Iraq, they don't really get a lot of water anymore. And I'm forgetting the name of the city, maybe it's Basra right there on this map. They actually are suffering really, really badly. One of the reasons why they're suffering badly is because they don't have access to water because it's been dammed off so far. So conceivably speaking, this is happening all over the world, not just in Syria and Iraq. This water issue and competition over fresh water could become like the number one resource that countries need, and a war could end up being fought over rivers. All right, talking briefly about social inequalities going on there. I already mentioned apartheid. The other big event that happened, I'm blanking on Tiananmen Square exactly the year. I think it was late 1980s, maybe early 1990s. I need to look it up. But Tiananmen Square was actually a pro-democracy protest in China that was eventually put down. But there was a very famous picture, which I do not have on here, of a man standing in front of a tank, basically daring the tank to kill him. And that protest was eventually squashed by the Chinese government. And in fact, if you go to China today and you mention Tiananmen Square, they are not going to be happy with you. I would highly advise you to not mention the Tiananmen Square if you ever go to China. And of course, one thing about history is you teach people the history you want them to learn. So in China, they don't teach the Tiananmen Square to their students. So if you actually talk to a lot of Chinese in China, a lot of them probably don't even know the protest even happened because the government's actively suppressing it. Going to India, they technically do not have the caste system anymore. When they became independent in the 1940s, they got rid of the caste system. And they actually do here. The caste reserve system is supposedly the idea where they're going to work together with, where they're going to abolish it and actually help people in the lower caste, or traditionally were in the lower caste, move up in society and in government. However, I will say unofficially, the caste system still definitely does exist in India, and there still is discrimination that does happen. The other conflict that's happening in India, which is, I think, intensifying right now, is the Hindu-Muslim conflict, which I mentioned earlier in there, where the Hindu majority who's ruling the government right now is trying to suppress and get rid of any traces of Muslims in India right now, even renaming cities and roads that sound Muslim. That's how crazy they're getting. The other big social inequality that I don't know if that necessarily met the curriculum yet because it's still another very recent thing is the crisis that was happening in Syria. And pictured right here is Aleppo. And there was a rebellion against the leader of Syria a few years ago, and it's still ongoing even right now. The United States, we supported the people who were rebelling against Assad, the dictator there in Syria, whereas Russia was supporting Assad. And I think about last year, Trump decided to stop supporting the rebels and basically decide to let Assad do what he wants to do. Oh, I think I read an article more recently that even Russia this year is starting to get fed up with Assad. So Syria is still definitely a hot button issue that has not been solved yet. But as a result of the civil war, a lot of refugees from Syria have spilled out, and very recently, like the last 5 years, have went into Europe and tried to settle there. And there's a lot of when we talk about nationalism is growing in Europe. One of the reasons why nationalism is growing in Europe is because they have a lot of these others who are poor and famished and need a lot of help and don't are not culturally European, especially Germany. Germany accepted the most. Trying to assimilate in that society, and also, Germans have to take them. So there's a big debate over should we even allow refugees in? And there's been a lot of resistance against refugees very recently. It's kind of a reaction for what's happened, in Syria and them coming over. Some terrorist things that have happened that are the big hot button issues. Obviously, there's a lot more terrorist activity that happened. I just picked the top two to talk. No, well, I guess maybe not the top two. I guess arguably the top two to talk about. So the first one is in Northern Ireland. So Ireland wanted independence. But they're mostly Catholic. However, most of England, which was controlling it during that time period, was Protestant. So they had the IRA, Irish Republican Army, demanded freedom, and Ireland did become an independent country. However, you see right there that little Northern Ireland is still technically part of England because there actually is a Protestant majority there. And Northern Ireland people were famous for car bombing in the 1990s. That issue with Ireland is no longer a violent issue at this point in time. However, I remember it did come up last year with Brexit because Irish people still want to cross the border with Northern Ireland, and Ireland is still remaining in the United Nations, whereas Northern Ireland is not in the United Nations now. So one of the hot button issues was, what do you do with that border? Because technically, if one's in the free trade zone and one's not in the free trade zone, you have to erect a barrier. And if you erect a barrier, that's going to get a lot of people angry. The other big issue, which is something I hopefully don't have to talk to you guys too much about, which is 9/11. When a series of airplanes hit our Twin Towers in New York City, hit the Pentagon, and one was actually taken down in Pennsylvania before it hit its target. And that's been affecting you guys your whole entire life. It got United States involved in a lot of Middle Eastern wars, most pointedly Iraq and Afghanistan. So the last thing we're going to talk about today is questioning, is this globalized world that we live in, is it actually a positive thing? I would argue, yes, it's mostly a positive thing. However, there have been a lot of negatives as a result of globalization. And one of the number one organizations that people protest against is the World Trade Organization. It's the organization that advocates for free trade around the world. So think about it. One is, where are your goods coming from? So even as consumers, sometimes we could be supporting things in foreign countries that we otherwise would not support just because we need the minerals. I'll give you an example from an article I read last year. I'm an iPhone user. I have an iPhone, and I think this might be true for other smartphones as well. But a lot of those precious metals that are made in our phones are actually mined by child labor in Africa. So by buying a smartphone, indirectly, you're funding child labor. Or you can think about even like sweatshops, like t-shirts and things like that. Like sometimes maybe the clothing that we wear were made by people who are being underfunded and underpaid for what they're actually doing. So there's the moral argument behind it is we don't even know who's producing the things that we're consuming, and we could end up, it could result in these huge economic inequalities around the world that we're not even aware of. The other thing you can think of is climate change, which I've already mentioned before, is that it's destroying this world, our globalized economy, traveling around the world, burning tons of fossil fuels. is I guess hurting the world a lot, especially here in the United States. If you even fly an airplane once, or even just a normal American living with the amount of the food that we choose to eat, our carbon footprints are so large that if the rest of the world did live just like a typical American did, it would I don't know exactly what happened, but the world's global footprint would be huge. Carbon footprint would be huge, and like I mentioned before, most of the time the countries that are going to get worst by climate change is going to end up being uh, those poor countries. I forgot to mention this in the last slide, but it just popped in my head. I had the word Anthropocene up there, and Anthropocene is basically the idea that some scientists have started this idea, or historians have started this idea, that it used to be, if you look at the geological layers, like each layer of soil represents a different time in history. Some scientists say that we've entered a new layer in geological time, and that is the human, the Anthropocene, and that humans have so impacted the world now and are good at changing it so radically that we will show up in the fossil records, like the soil records from here on out, would be known as the time of humans. And that is a radical claim, but it's also a claim that has been gaining in popularity the last decade or two. And in fact, so popular, it actually did end up making your AP curriculum, which I was kind of tickled about. There is a lot of truth to about it, that we are probably the number one agent of change in the world, geologically speaking, too. The other thing about globalized things we want to talk about is threats to sovereignty. So we have a lot of transnational organizations like Google, Apple, a lot of tobacco companies that have such a huge economy that their economics are actually much larger than a lot of poorer countries. And one of the arguments again for those poorer countries, those smaller countries, is that a lot of times these multinational corporations can come there and basically take over the country and do things that the smaller country doesn't want them to do. And yes, those smaller countries can take them to court. Like I'm thinking tobacco did get taken to court. But one of the negative things that happens, and one of the things you learn about our law system, that even if you're in the wrong, if you have more money, you can still end up probably winning just because you outspend your opponents. So a lot of these smaller nations just feel threatened because, their sovereignty can be taken over by these organizations. And last but not least, this is not on your AP exam, but I think it's become more relevant, especially this last month, is talking about how the rapid spread of disease can happen a lot quicker because we are a much more interconnected world. And one of the things that's being debated right now in the United States, which I guess we'll see for years to come what we end up doing, is how I mentioned how a lot of those factories are being done overseas now and not being done in the United States. What happens if those trade routes get disrupted, like what's happening here in this pandemic? And now all of a sudden we don't have the goods that we need to do. Like the example I'll give you right now, they're talking about the N95, I believe, mask that a lot of doctors wear. Currently in the United States, there is precisely one factory in the whole entire United States that produces those masks. All other of those masks, N95 masks, are being produced by foreign countries. And even more, think about if we ever do get in a big war with other countries, what happens if we're relying on other countries to produce our weapons? So we're using like Chinese-made, rifles to fight, another country or whatnot. So there's a big push going on here, and something that might end up happening in the next 4 or 5 years or so, where the United States starts opening up more factories, not necessarily because it's more efficient to open up that factory, but just more of basically a hedge to make sure that our country has the factories that we need just in case trade routes get disrupted again. All right, so that's it for our unit. I just want to end by saying thank you guys for being wonderful students this year. I hope you guys have a great summer, and I really, really hope I see you guys again in the fall. Please take care.